Madness. Every one of us, every human being has a touch of madness. It doesn't have to be murder or speaking in tongues. It can be as simple as trying your absolute best in spite of the massive odds against you, or ignoring as the world falls apart around you. But madness can also be kindness, and madness can be truth. Crow Country is a survival horror game about a mysterious young woman going to an abandoned amusement park to find a missing man. The game has a retro aesthetic. It looks similar to Final Fantasy VII's overworld, but had the gameplay of classics like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. But that description boils down this game so much. I don't want to spoil too much of this video, but this game moved me to tears. I loved its world, I loved its characters and its writing. I loved the way that it gave me questions and tricked me every little bit of the way. It kept me guessing, and it kept showing me answers to these questions without ever telling me they were answers until the time was just right. And I want to share all of that with you. In today's video, I hope to share with you the game's story and world, the many mysteries that haunt every corner of this abandoned amusement park and the monsters within, and how this game really is about humanity and all the horrors that come with being human. I'm going to tell you why it's a modern survival horror classic, how it gets almost everything right, and why you should play it even if you watch and enjoy this video. Yes, there are going to be spoilers in this video, so I say this with my whole chest. If you're interested in playing the game, please do so before watching this video. And if this video makes you interested in playing the game, even having been spoiled, do it. It's a fantastic game and an incredible value at only $20 US. My video will obviously be a different experience than actually playing it. I'll be covering a lot of the game, but not everything, so there will be some surprises if you do watch this video first and then play the game later. And if you stick around till the end of the video, I'll tell you of one of the little secrets that happens in the very beginning of the game that a lot of people did not even notice. Having said all that, let's dive into the maddening world of Crow Country. Crow Country starts with a still in the current year, before counting down backwards to the year the game actually takes place, 1990. And then our main character begins talking to us, the players. You play as Mara Forrest, a special agent who's come to the abandoned theme park, Crow Country, to look for its mysterious owner and proprietor, Edward Crow. His daughter had called in a missing persons report on him, and the park is the last place he was seen. The titular theme park is in an obvious state of disrepair when Mara arrives. The ground is littered with cigarette butts and other theme park-based refuse, as well as trash bags and other things, but of course, that's not all. I'd argue that large piles of bloody flesh and rib cages and toilets aren't usual amusement park fare unless they're in the horror-themed part of the park, which, in this case, they aren't. You know, I've definitely seen worse bathrooms at real-life amusement parks, though. Us and Mara begin to explore the park, slowly meeting new characters and unraveling the story bit by bit. Through a series of notes, character interactions, and mysterious phone calls with an unknown source, we learn about the park's history, but these are just the upfront ways the game tells its story. As Crow Country does an excellent job of using environmental storytelling to show rather than tell. A good example being at the very start of the game where you find a backpack, a magazine, and then later a camera before finally meeting the NPC who owned all of these items and left them strewn around in typical video game style. From the get-go, Crow Country is full of mystery. What happened here? Why is the park run down? And what's with all this blood and detritus? This place was once meant to bring families joy, and now it's a place of nightmares, a setting for a survival horror game. Having said that, you can't have a survival horror game without scary antagonists, and there are antagonists in this game, monsters to be specific, and plenty of them. One of my favorite things about this game is the design variety of the enemies, called guests, and they all look wildly different. But one thing they all have in common is that while creepy, you kind of feel bad for them. Well, not all of them. I really hate these guys, and these guys too, they're spooky as hell. But the noises they make, while horrific, also sound sad and pained. They scream and howl. Some breathe in labored grunts. Their noises are inhuman, but they sound tortured. The way they move almost implies that doing so hurts them. There's something deeply disturbing about these things on multiple levels, not just the fact that they're trying to kill you. And while some have a permanent monstrous grin on their faces, Others look lost, are deeply pained, or just like nothing we know. I think Mara puts it best after killing the first two enemies in the game. I feel bad killing it, but I'd feel bad leaving it alive too. Also, look at this thing. This thing. It just does not look right. It's like, I don't even want to say what it kind of looks like. Get back in that wall, you little freak. So we continue to explore the park. We avoid or kill monsters, and we slowly begin to gather evidence that help clue us in on these mysteries, all the while solving puzzles and grabbing items that open up more of the labyrinthian place that was once meant to make children happy. We also begin to get an idea of our main character's personality. Mara can be a bit silly and lighthearted, but also very helpful. Even if she jokes around by herself, she does what she needs to do to get things done and make sure other people are taken care of. The playfulness is nice. It's not over the top, and it's usually done within her own head. The kind of thing that a lot of people do in these type of situations to lift their own spirits. One of the moments that sticks out to me specifically is when solving the goose puzzle, and then this happens and she just reacts by going, "Oh my god." As I said just a bit ago, as we go along, we begin to put things together about what's going on in Crow Country. One of the first things unveiled to us is the fact that the park was, in fact, being used to secretly mine gold. It even seems that the entire reason for the park being created was to hide this fact. You can find a newspaper about the establishment of the park, and the dates also coincide with a note about the beginning of the excavation of something called the Roots. So you might be saying to yourself, what does the gold have to do with the monsters? And that's where things get more complicated. Throughout the game, we consistently hear mention of two unique things or entities that we don't see, at least not until later in the game. The Roots and the Pool. The Roots, we find out, and as I just hinted at a moment ago, are apparently where they're getting the gold. And the Pool is somehow connected to the monsters. But we don't have the information needed to solve this puzzle just yet, so us and Mara press on. Another way we unravel the story is by interacting with the game's cast of characters. There are 7 key characters in the story. The first, and the first person we met, is Arthur Mole, a young man who came to the amusement park to try and document the creatures so he can sell their photos to an oddities magazine that we find in a bathroom. He doesn't actually have much impact on the story, but he is a character of consequence affected by the goings-on in the park. Julie, a powerful local lawyer representing someone who is apparently hurt by one of these creatures before the park shut down. The person in question is actually the reason the park shut down completely, as we'll find out later. Marvin, one of Edward Crow's business partners in the gold mining. He went to Brazil to find a mine that they could pretend they got the gold from, when in reality they were getting it from the mysterious source underneath the park, but I'll talk more on that later. Tolman, another business associate of Edward's who oversaw the excavation of the gold, but also seemed to be a close friend of Edward Crow's. Harrison James, a goofy but well-meaning police officer who was first contacted about the disappearance of Edward Crow by Crow's daughter, Natalie Crow. And last but not least, Natalie Crow, Edward's daughter, who'd come to the park to look for him and gets attacked while doing so. She came to meet Harrison, who shows up late for some reason. And last but not least, a mysterious man on the phone who calls Mara throughout the adventure and gives hints as to what's really going on. Those are the 7 characters that we interact with if you don't include Mara herself. Each and every one of these characters' stories interweaves with the plot of the game, except Arthur, who just came to take a photograph of the monsters and then basically hurts his knee. While not overly important, as I said earlier, he is a character of consequence because he is affected by what's going on in the park. I think the characters of Crow Country, while relatively simple, are also one of the most interesting parts of the game narratively. When you think about each of these characters, each one of them has a varyingly valid reason to come to the theme park, ranging from, okay, that's understandable, to why would you endanger your life like that? Crow Country almost has this, Silent Hill-esque feeling where it almost seems like destiny has brought all these characters together. I don't think the park is testing them in that way, but for the most part, it makes sense. A lot of these characters didn't or don't know about the monsters, but even when they learn about them, they don't leave. Arthur took a photo of the monsters when the park first shut down and came back to get a better photo of the monsters as proof. He does want to leave throughout the game, but Mara implies she has unfinished business, which is apparently finding Crow. Marvin is in hiding because the Brazilian authorities discovered that the gold from their mine did not originate from Brazil. Harrison is a police officer who was originally assigned to the Edward Crowe case before Mara came along. He's well-meaning, but kind of a doofus, which is why he sticks around, because he wants to help even though he doesn't really get much done. Tolman just never left apparently, though it seems he's trying to hide or protect something or someone. And Julie is here because of something we've read about in the notes as we go through the game. When we first find Julie, she's banging on this door in the Haunted Hills, one of the 4 sections of the park. Well, one of the 4 theme park sections, because there's way more to the park than that. When we let her into this area, we find out exactly why she's here. As I said earlier, Julie is a lawyer for the family of a girl whose name is Elaine Marshall. Elaine ran into one of the monsters in the park before it shut down, but plot twist, they had it in a cage. Let me tell you a bit more about these monsters, aka the guests. The first guest came out of that thing called the pool, and they confirm this when they fully witness other guests coming out of it, as said in this note. The first guest was moved from this mysterious place known as the pool to a cell in the Haunted Hills area of the park, where they interrogated it, and where it apparently stayed from March 1988, the month it came out of the pool, all the way until July 1988. Which is the month of Elaine Marshall's birthday. She happened to get lost at the park while celebrating her birthday and wandered into the holding room where the first guest was. While in this room, Elaine apparently got too close to the bars and the guest reached through and scratched her, which would apparently make her ill. From this, we learn that the guests are seemingly infectious in some way, making things with Arthur a bit more serious. We also learn, well, this is what Elaine Marshall looks like. Notice anything? The game hints at it pretty early, but Mara isn't exactly what she seems. Now, this was the moment I realized that Mara might be Elaine Marshall, but of course I kept my guard up in case there was another plot twist later, like Mara being her older sister or something. But there are a lot of hints that Mara is Elaine Marshall early on in the game. One that I accidentally caught myself was with Arthur. In the game, Mara helps Arthur back to her car, but it does this by just cutting to black and bringing you right back to the Fairytale village. Of course, because the developers of this game are rad as hell, you can go back and actually talk to Arthur a few times, and Mara will mention during one of these conversations that she was also attacked by the monsters. But in my playthrough, I hadn't even seen the monsters yet. I thought this was an error on the part of the game. Maybe the developers assumed you would have seen the monsters already, but it wasn't. She already had been attacked by the monsters 2 years earlier in 1988. This is an incredibly clever and missable bit of foreshadowing, but the game hints to it pretty consistently in other little ways. Like the fact that Mara says she can't smoke if you go up to a cigarette vending machine. I first thought she meant like it was prohibited by her job, which is weird considering how many government agents smoke and things like that. Or the fact that she doesn't drink coffee. I currently can't drink coffee right now because of my anxiety, but I didn't drink it when I was a teenager, and as an adult, I actually like the taste of coffee. You see, Elaine, aka Mara, was 15 when she was hurt, meaning she's only 17 or 18 now, so it makes sense that she isn't allowed to smoke, and that she doesn't drink coffee. It's even kind of funny when you think about it, the fact that she respects what are probably her parents' wishes not to smoke, but they probably didn't want her to come to this theme park as well, but we don't know that full on just yet. But hey, good for her. Good habits are good habits, and not smoking is a good thing, even if it looks really cool. Another little hint is that she already knows Julie's name. This is another really clever little thing that the game does, but never really draws attention to. Most of the characters, when you first talk to them, it says a general descriptor instead of their name, like strange man or cop or something like that. But with Julie, it just says Julie, hinting that our character already knew her name before meeting her here. It's these little attention to details that make moments like this in this game freaking amazing to me. Like, yeah, when I figured out, I felt kind of dumb, but no, that's also really cool. That's why stuff like this is so great. It completely recontextualizes previous information that we got up until this point and makes you feel like, oh my god, I can't believe I didn't see this coming. Remember at the start when it seems that Mara is talking to us? She isn't. She's actually reminding herself of her own cover story. She's also the one who slashed poor Harrison James' tires. But okay, why is Mara here then? Why is Elaine here then? Well, we partially know. Whatever these monsters are, they attacked her and it seems to have given her some type of illness. But she isn't a monster, so what's that all about? And what's with the number 2106? I didn't mention this before, but very early on, in fact right before we meet Arthur at the start of the game, we find a bunch of papers with the number 2106 painted on them in blood. You wonder, is it a code? What does it mean? Another mystery to ponder as we continue on. So we continue our adventure through the theme park known as Crow Country. Over time, we accrue an assortment of seemingly random items that are actually quite useful. Keys to unlock doors, things to solve puzzles. The game does a good job of explaining away what is usually written off in these games as nonsense. The employees left memos of the things going on in the park. It seems that the park was a mess even before it shut down. Keys getting lost, people stealing items from other parts of the park to make their own job easier. Not to mention how many parts of the park are just dangerous, but I'll talk more on that later. Though, of course, there are some mystical, gamey elements, but most are just bonuses, and even then, I think it adds to the game's charm. Some things just happen, and just like real life, that can happen. I mentioned earlier that it felt like destiny or some magnetic pull brought all these characters to Crow Country, but that's not the only strange thing about the park. And this goes into the main story as well, but we'll get to that later. There are strange, unexplainable things that happen in Crow Country, like a fairy robot that brings you a key, or the fact that there's a group of secret magic mushroom boys who will help you upgrade your weapons. Yes, that's true. They're silly but neat, and I like them. I mean, look at this little guy. The Mushroom Boys are secrets, so they're probably not meant to be canon, but thinking that they are is interesting and fun in a dumb way. There are other secrets hidden throughout the park as well, as helpful as they are interesting. But even setting aside the bonuses in the game, there's the park itself, the atmosphere it has, the fact that it had this double duplicitous purpose to hide this bigger thing going on underneath the surface, quite literally, and the fact that even before the monsters were here, the park was dangerous. There are bookcases in the haunted Hilltop section of the park that can actually kill you, and I mean actually kill you. A spike comes out at one point in my playthrough and just goes through Mara's brain. Oh my god. You can even read a memo referencing how dangerous these bookcases are. There's spike walls that are meant to scare you, but if they malfunctioned, they could actually kill people. Not to mention that the creator of the park brought one of these monsters up into the park and then ran the park with that up at the top for months, even as monsters continued appearing out of this mysterious thing called the pool. And I'm just talking about the park when it was actually up and running, not even the condition it's in when you're playing the game, with all these booby traps full of monsters and the state of disrepair. And yes, you just heard me right. Ignoring the parts of the park that were already dangerous on purpose as part of the park's design, someone begins to booby trap the place as you explore it to try and stop you from finding the truth. Another mystery to add to the list. But continuing on this idea of the park being dangerous when it was being run, there are a number of explanations for this, but for now I'll simply relay to everyone that the fact that parks like Action Park existed in the 80s. So it makes sense that this theme park would exist and be dangerous because of lax regulations on safety for people going to places like this. For a little history, Action Park was an incredibly infamous theme park that seemed to have little regard for the safety of the guests or even the people working at the park. The odd and dangerous designs of Crow Country could be a reference to the lax safety standards of theme parks in the 70s and 80s, wanting to put excitement and coolness above people's lives and mental well-being. I say mental well-being because in another part of the haunted Hilltop, you are threatened by an arm with a fake shotgun and a timer. This is meant for kids, by the way. This would have probably made me cry as a child. The moment it burst out did actually scare me when playing the game as well. Oh, Jesus. Not to mention the room with plates holding actually poisonous mushrooms. A little aside, but this is one of the most Silent Hill looking rooms in the game. This room is legitimately dreadful to be in. Of course, this just shows the love that was put into the game to craft its atmosphere by the developers. I love so many parts of this game and the way they feel. I love the scary witch section that you have to maneuver with wind blowing and like this haunting music in the background. I love this section of the park that just seems inspired by the back rooms. It's almost shameless, but in the best way. Not that you should feel ashamed for referencing something in this way, because this is incredibly rad. Oh yeah, and there's a secret Scooby-Doo face hole behind a painting. Like, some of this is just classic. I love this, but also, why is this in a theme park? I mean, we know the answer, but it even adds to the characters. The fact that Edward Crowe added this little facehold to spy on an employee lounge shows how weird and paranoid he was as a person. A lot can be explained away by the fact that the park itself was a cover-up for the secret things going on, but it still gives an incredibly strange feeling to the whole place. Even if some of it has rational explanations, with so many strange things, it just coalesces into this place that feels like separate from the normal world. Which an amusement park or theme park is already supposed to do that, but not in the way that this one does. So we know that the park is a cover-up for the gold being extracted from this thing called the roots. We also know there's another thing called the pool, and that's where the guests came from. The biggest hint we have to what the pool is from this log, which describes them placing things in the pool, then pulling them out only to find them disfigured, making it seem like some type of magical pool of water or portal or something like that. And the number 2106 appearing again, painted in the wall in the offices in blood, seemingly by the guests, but we don't know yet. Soon after, we finally meet Tolman, who is cagey and does not give us much advice or hints as to what is going on. Tolman even mentions it in his notes. It's not a keypad number, it's not a code. None of the keypads in this game have any zeros on them. So what does it mean? So, we activate the elevators to go down to the underground section of the park, and he tells us not to go down there. But of course we ignore him and go down there anyway. We learn a lot down in this section of the map. We see the roots for the first time, and see that under the park is a giant cavernous area, which they've built a network of metal rafters to navigate. The roots themselves are odd. They're green plant-looking like things, but are actually metallic, and are apparently cut in sections to harvest the gold that is in the center of them. So now we know that these are the roots, and this is where the gold comes from. Despite being made of what looks to be metal, they're called the roots because they do look like giant plant roots. We also later get a confirmation that they are made of metal by Tolman. We also get a word from the horse's mouth, aka Marvin, that he's here because the authorities are after him. But that's not all we see down here. For some reason, Edward decided to do little experiments in the different rooms on the guests. Despite the guests being monsters, these experiments look incredibly cruel, like this one, which features a continuous drop of acid onto what I imagine was at one point a living guest. In some way, it does seem like it's still alive, but I don't think it's alive in the way we'd usually think of something as living. Not only that, but just before coming down here, we learned that the man calling us throughout the game was, in fact, Edward Crowe. I had a suspicion of this from the very start, but of course you never just want to say this is the guy until he tells you that's who he is. Edward does not seem mentally all there. It's obvious that he's hiding somewhere in the park, more than likely the deepest section which we don't have access to yet. He admits that he didn't mean for all of this to happen, that he didn't even want to harvest the roots, but apparently his father was doing it even before him. And he seemingly feels grief over the fact that his daughter, Natalie, became infected after coming to look for him. We learn this in all of the phone calls throughout the game. Eventually, we are able to get into Crowe's office, which has been locked from an early point and even electrified because this man, like I said, is very paranoid. Here we find a few interesting things. Crowe is stocked up with a lot of medicine. This could be explained by the fact that he has a degree in a medical and science-based field, or it's possible that he himself is sick, which was hinted at in an earlier note. He's also made a slideshow documenting the different guests that have appeared and apparently finds a correlation between their deteriorating states and the destruction of the roots as they harvest for the gold. And, last but not least, a giant golden statue of his deceased wife, who apparently died pretty young, 8 years before the start of the game. This event could have added to his mental deterioration, as it obviously shows by him having a giant golden statue of his wife that he really cared for her. But of course, that's not all, as we've already learned that Edward Crowe has a penchant for secret rooms. Behind the statue of his wife, we can find a room meant to emulate a campsite, as he loved the outdoors as a child. Here we find his childhood journal, which discusses him and his father discovering the roots on a camping trip to a place called Condor Country. His father would inevitably buy the land and rename it to Crow Country. We also find the final and only untouched root, which Crowe earlier said they left for posterity. It wiggles around and does seem unnatural, but also kind of cute. It's weird. There's also a touching moment between Mara and Natalie here. It shows that Natalie is aware of her father's misdeeds, but of course doesn't want him to die. Mara agrees not to kill him. I like this moment because it shows a lot of humanity from both of these characters. Mara in showing kindness by agreeing to give Crow a final chance, and Natalie in her smarts, piecing together a lot of what's going on without really needing to say so, and asking for Mara to spare her father, even if she herself knows he might not be worthy of that mercy. But I'll talk more on the characterization later. After this, we solve a puzzle involving the slides mentioned earlier, turn on a button that will unlock the secret elevator to the center deepest part of the park, and continue towards our confrontation with Edward Crow. From this point on, a lot happens all at once because we are hurtling towards the end of the game. Rain sets upon Crow Country as we find that the offices is covered in more bloody paintings by what we can only assume to be the guests. We also find Julie having been pushed into a box by someone with sweaty hands. I think we can easily take a guess at who that might be, but we'll only find out later. Julie helps us have some fun on an aquatic-themed ride and also get a battery, but is seemingly hurt or killed and taken by something. We don't know what. Someone else also begins killing the guests and even takes a shot at us. Whoa. We then take the battery from earlier, charge it, and begin our journey to the final area of the game. The deepest center part of the park. This final area is fantastic. Here we learn a few harrowing things. Harrison James is dead, but no, he wasn't killed by the monsters. He's been shot, and we very quickly learn who did it. It was none other than the crook Marvin, who, scared for his life and own well-being, killed James and is planning to kill Mara too. More than likely, he was the one who took the shot at us earlier, and killed all the guests above the ground. But, lucky for us, Julie appears from a nearby vent, knocking Marvin into the dark depths below where he hurtles to his inevitable death. This is some trick. Where am I? We help Julie out, learning that the creatures actually meant us no harm and are simply trying to communicate. I find that hard to believe considering all of the game, but they didn't hurt Julie, at least not too seriously. Despite this, we continue on, sending Julie and Tolman to collect Harrison's body, save Natalie, and wait for us at the car. It's time for us to finish our business with Edward Crow. What follows are two of my favorite moments in Crow Country, for their simplicity and impact. The next room we move into is a spring, a calmer reflection of things to come. Mara washes the dirt and grime from her body, a clean slate to go into the final confrontation. Then, we slowly climb down a very long ladder to the final area. The final area, the true deepest part of the park, as a moving song plays. It's a long climb down. This gives us a few moments to think about everything we've just experienced. The death of Harrison James and Marvin, a good man and a terrible one, the fact that the monsters apparently weren't trying to hurt us, and the coming confrontation with the person who apparently caused all of this, Edward Crow. We descend into the darkness below. We enter Edward Crow's secret lab and look around. We see pictures of all the characters, including Mara herself. Throwback to the start, it seems that Edward was watching us on the cameras throughout the park the entire time. It looks as if he was in fact sick. He also had an easy way to get back to the surface, more than likely connected to his office in some way, but it looks like we won't be taking that way back. We see a note for his daughter as well, but Mara has enough respect for Natalie not to read it. Oh yeah, and if you couldn't tell, you can wash the dye out of Mara's hair, confirming that she, yes, is Elaine Marshall. It's not a big moment, but it doesn't need to be. It's there, and that's what matters. After investigating the lab for a bit, we finally speak to Edward through the PA system next to a large, foreboding door. He asks us to collect the 5 vials on a nearby table, so we do. But first, we put down every item we've gathered in the park to clear space. This moment is so simple, yet so utterly fantastic. Why? Because I love a lot of this game, and there are a lot of moments I could call my favorite. But this is up there because it gives me time to look back at all of those moments together and cherish the time that I spent playing the game. Not just the story, but actually playing it, collecting these items, solving these puzzles. They even went through the effort of having Mara herself acknowledge where each and every item came from and how you got it. Pardon me not using big fancy words, but that's just cool, and it made me smile. It makes me wonder if this moment was as much a look back on the game for the developers when they were finishing it as it was for us players. Both this moment and the latter segment let you reflect on the whole experience. The latter gives us a moment to process the emotional weight of the events of the story, the death of Harrison, the fact that the monsters apparently weren't trying to hurt us, the coming confrontation with Edward. Just this moment with the items lets us reflect on the game part of the journey. Each step we had to take throughout the game, each little bit we had to unlock to get here. I beat the game in a 2-day span, but this moment seriously made me reminisce of how I started the game just the days before, or even got a new item a few hours earlier before beating it. But enough looking back. We have to move forward now and face Edward Crow. We walk along a fenced path that leads to the only part of this mystery we have yet to see in person, the pool, and there waiting for us is Edward Crow himself. Edward sits in a rocking chair, shirtless and listening to music while smoking a cigarette and enjoying a glass of wine. How villainous. He's covered in sores, the same as the guests. He calls Mara by her real name, Elaine Marshall. She admits that she's come to tell him that the infection is going to kill her, and he tells her that he didn't pay for her medical expenses in the hope that she or someone would come to the park to find him, that anyone that comes in contact with the guests will be infected. In fact, the longer you spend around them, the faster the infection progresses. This seems to be because of some unknown bacteria that covers their bodies, but Crow's made a cure through his experimentation on them. But what are the guests, and what is the pool? This is when things get exceptionally dark for everyone. The guests were human beings once, and the pool is, in fact, a portal to the future. The roots are, or were, in fact, antenna, a way to receive a signal from the future to the current time period. When Crow's father, and then him, began extracting the gold from the roots, thus destroying them, it caused the signal to come through imperfectly. The destruction of the roots caused the people coming through to become mutated, turning them into what we now see and know as the guests. Their physical bodies horribly mutated as they passed through the broken portal. The bacteria on their skin and inside of them began mutating as well, becoming monstrous. Crow admits that the first guest was able to speak and told him everything, but he still kept harvesting the roots anyway. We've been killing mutated human beings the entire time, or what once were human beings. Maybe they did have some of their humanity left, but it's incredibly hard to tell, isn't it? At least for some of them. It is this mutated bacteria that has infected Mara, and now we know every single character that has come in contact with the guests. But as mentioned moments ago, Crow managed to create a cure. He is a scientist after all. Those cruel experiments he conducted on the guests seem to have had some use after all, though it's hard to really feel good about any of this, even the parts that are going to save our characters. The 5 vials in our inventory are the cure, one for each survivor, which does not include Crow. Yes, Crow has decided to punish himself for his crimes by jumping into the portal. Is it really a punishment, though? To see what he has wrought upon the future, he says. He hands Mara a sheet of paper that was mentioned earlier that apparently has the words of the first guest mentioned on it that explains this entire situation. But of course, he must commit one last selfish act before he goes, asking Mara to kill him if he should re-emerge. Mara says nothing, but knows she'll do it. We do too. Crow says goodbye, raises the glass of wine to Mara's future, and then rocks himself backwards into the pool. Us and Mara, or Elaine, sit there for just a moment, trying to take in what we've just been told. The roots disappear into the pool. The world shakes around us and then goes still. We, and Mara, open the note in our inventory. It reads, 2106 Uninhabitable Ruin. We come to 1988. Last chance. Warn. Stop change. We don't have much time to sit with the gravity of this final revelation, though. Crow, or what once was Crow, re-emerges. The monstrosity attacks us. For a moment, he's lost his humanity, and we must fight the mutated Crow. So we do. The song that plays during this moment is aptly called An Act of Mercy. The fight is long and bloody, so much so that the pool becomes a reflection of what it was and not what it was meant to be. This device, or whatever it was, a miracle thing, nearly magic, meant to save humanity from a terrible future that instead twisted people into monsters because of one family's hubris, destroying countless lives in the present and the times to come. Crow literally bathes in this pool of blood, this pool of his own blood. We beat him. He sinks back into the pool, half dead, and tries to speak. Tries to tell Mara of the horrible future he saw on the other side of the pool. But Mara, in disgust, says she doesn't care about what he has to say. Despite everything that's happened, despite everything that him and his family has done, Mara gives Crow his last wish, an act of mercy that he may not deserve. No more misery, no more pain, no more madness. We're then given the option to drink the cure as the screen goes to black. All 5 survivors, whether we drink the cure or not, sit around Mara's car, taking in the reality of the situation, thinking on everything that's happened. Years upon years of events that have led to this moment, and a doomed future, or possibly a doomed future. Natalie mourns for her father that she lost, as everyone else stays lost in thought, dealing with the weight of what has happened, and what may or may not happen. Remember that countdown at the start of the game? Does that make more sense now? It, like so many other things in this game, are a reference to the overall themes and the mysteries underneath the surface of Crow Country. The countdown not only shows us the year the game takes place, but also the progression of time, that we've gotten closer to whatever this humanity-ending event that the first guest, the first horrifically mutated human being, told Edward Crow about. What might this event be? Fans of the game have speculated on what this future could be. The 2 ideas I've seen the most are climate change-caused disaster or something to do with the bacteria infesting the bodies of the guests. My personal thoughts are that it is the climate change type of disaster, but both are a possibility. There are a lot of references to the climate crisis throughout the game, however subtle, from the guests lighting the globe in the haunted manor on fire to the fact that the story itself is a direct reference to how the climate crisis and many other horrific events are caused in our real world, which I'll talk about in a few more moments. It could be that the bacteria in the game was caused by a climate-based crisis in the future, as the increasing heat in our world has been linked to the growing of serious infectious diseases and bacteria. As I mentioned earlier, these bacteria might have been made only worse when mutated along with the people by the malfunctioning portal that was the pool and the roots. Of course, it could be that the problem in the future is the bacteria on its own, which Edward cured, but I think that is far less likely, as he doesn't even seem to believe that he stopped whatever this horrific future is. The fact that people of the future thought 1988 was the perfect year to stop this catastrophe might also mean something. 1988 was the first year that climate change first took international news and people began to take it far more seriously in our real world. And, as I mentioned earlier, the game's story is a direct parallel to how the climate crisis has gotten so bad in our own world.
Researchers say that one of the world's biggest oil companies made highly accurate predictions about global warming while publicly dismissing any link between fossil fuels and climate change. The study in the journal Science says ExxonMobil's scientists knew about the risks of fossil fuels starting in the 1970s, but chose not to disclose them.
The story of Crow Country is literally about a group of men dooming humanity for profit, which is very similar to so many real-world problems. Marvin is the most greedy, as he does want the money directly, and was either told or figured out the truth at some point and simply did not care, but Crow is far more complicated. Crow himself states that he doesn't care about the gold or the money, and it seems he only does what he does to appease the request of his dead father. Though bizarrely, even after being told what's happening by the first guest, he doesn't stop excavating the roots. In fact, he begins to experiment on the guests. It seems some of this was to develop a cure for the bacterial infection, but other parts of this experimentation just seem cruel. While Edward did cure whatever bacteria was spreading in the present, he did not stop the future catastrophe. He only solved problems that he, his father, and his conspirators caused, all out of greed or just insanity. This is where we get into the more character-driven aspects of Crow Country, and this is something I really love about this game. Every character in this game is made to serve the core story in some way, while holding consistent to their own characterization. You can understand a lot about the kind of people they are because of what they do during this horrific event. Like Elaine, aka Mara, the main character. I started to wonder why she'd come to Crow Country at all, how she's able to do what she does throughout the game, especially with the reveal that she is in fact a sickly teenager. And it made me think a lot about what she's going through. The fact that she was told by her doctors that she was going to die of this infection, and no treatment would work for 2 whole years. She didn't become a monster, but her infection was progressing slowly, and she had a lot of time to think about everything, her whole life, and everything around it. Whose fault all of this was? She didn't have many other choices. Crow even admits as much. She knew about the monsters, knew where Crow might be, and decided to go there. And it's possible that these 2 years changed her entire perspective on life. We see this in the way she talks to herself at the save points, and the final words closing the game. She has accepted her fate, whether it be bright or incredibly dark. And all she wanted to do at Crow Country was tell Crow that he'd killed her. A girl who seemed pretty happy and funny and nice was going to die young because of this man. This might not even have been her original goal. It is implied by Natalie at points that maybe she even came to kill Crow. She might have just come to talk to him, to figure out the truth, but the truth was awful. We only know tidbits of information about what happened before the game, but it's definitely possible that Mara escaped the hospital much earlier than coming to the park and trained herself for handling weapons. Or not, because in truth that part doesn't really matter. I personally like the idea that she's just been put in a horrible situation, and she's the kind of person that just rises to the occasion and does what she has to do. This is the path she's chosen, and it's the only path she really sees and has, so she does it. She's not optimistic or pessimistic about it, it's just what needs to be done. She's a kind enough person, she helps people when they need help, but she doesn't stop doing what she believes is right, fighting towards her goal, even if others question it. Mara had plenty of opportunities to leave the park, but she didn't, and I think that makes her character really interesting. She's a slightly more fleshed out Resident Evil archetypical character, and I think they did a really good job with her, even if a lot of it is subtle and meant to be filled in by the player. On the opposite side of the spectrum, there's Marvin. Marvin is like a dark mirror to Mara. Where Mara is an innocent teenager who is stricken with bad luck, Marvin is an alcoholic con man facing down the barrel of his own decisions. Marvin comes to the park because he's on the run. Mara comes to the park to face Edward and find some closure in her own death. Marvin is trying to escape death in a way. Not death literally, but something that seems as bad as death to him, imprisonment or worse, basically having his freedom taken away, the consequences of his own damn actions. He's scared enough of this to kill another innocent human being. He doesn't seem to second guess his actions or even feel remorse, instead bemoaning how unfair everything that's happening is to him. If we think about the game as symbolism for climate change, or how human beings don't care for the damage that they might do to the world and others, destroying things they don't understand and ignoring the consequences, the relationship between Crow and Marvin is also really interesting. Marvin doesn't care. He only wants to make money, to fulfill his hedonistic needs. The game implies that both him and Tolman figure out at some point what's going on, but they feel very differently about it. Marvin is an opportunistic capitalist. He cares only about himself, only about his own survival and his own wealth and well-being. He's an alcoholic and, by the end of the game, a murderer. I bring up that he's an alcoholic because it's hinted at that he has some type of addiction throughout the game, mentioning that he has a headache and also seems to have the shakes. Marvin's character shaking, as well as a few other bits of in-game storytelling, really tell you about this character, especially if you make a couple of assumptions about how the game played out. Another piece of in-game storytelling features traps that are slowly being laid out in the park for human beings, it seems. I'm not talking the bear traps that are there to catch the guests. I mean like traps for regular living people, things to trick them, bombs and poisons and gas traps and spiky things that fall down on you. The game never directly says who is placing these traps, but I and many other fans have theorized that it's Marvin doing this, and it's easy to lay blame on him, especially since the traps begin to appear after you first meet him, and especially because he's the only human character who actually tries to kill Mara and does successfully kill another human being in Harrison James. The other conspirators seem to feel some level of guilt. One of the most tragic of these is Douglas Pike. I didn't mention Douglas throughout the video as he plays a relatively small role, but he was the manager of operations at the park. It is implied that he knew very little about what was going on underneath the park, and when he found out, he felt incredibly guilty. When we do find Douglas in-game, he has literally just taken his own life. Douglas's daughter died years before the game, as you can find out through in-game context clues, and I imagine that in combination with learning what he'd accidentally been a part of is what pushed him over the edge. In talking about Douglas Pike, you can also see a bit of how Crow Country is about loss, as both Douglas Pike and Edward Crow lost someone very important to them and handled it in different ways. Douglas continued to run the amusement park, knowing it would give other families joy, and even placing a very touching memorial to his daughter in the place that he worked. Edward Crow, while feeling some remorse, continued to harvest the roots and continued to experiment on the guests, and we still don't know why he did that. He could have stopped. He could have even gone through the portal himself and tried to, warn the people on the other side, but he didn't. And not all of that can simply be written off as him working on the cure, because why keep harvesting the roots? It's a lot. Douglas felt an extreme sense of loss and also guilt, where Edward just seemed to press on, not caring what his actions were doing, not stopping, and instead doing what he knew, even if that could be seen as evil. Both went into their work, though you could obviously say Douglas did something far more positive than Edward. Not to mention a thought I just had while editing, the way that they both memorialize their own family shows this as well, where Edward says he doesn't care about the gold, but makes a giant golden statue of his wife, which, while touching, is incredibly excessive. Douglas put one in the park, and it is a simple grave and a dedication to her. You could say what Douglas did is strange because it's a public memorial in a theme park, but it also shows the hypocrisy of Edward. Then there's Tolman. Tolman is an interesting character in this regard. He eventually does turn off the machines that are harvesting the roots, and hints to Mara that he knows what the guests are. Tolman seems like a good person who has a strong sense of duty, but mostly keeps things close to his chest. He doesn't let on much to how he feels about the whole ordeal or his part in it, but it's obvious from certain notes and pieces of dialogue that he feels responsible and guilty. He does end up doing the right thing in most cases, but is obviously trying to protect Edward as well. It's an interesting conundrum with this character. And last but not least, we go back to Edward Crow. Edward continued harvesting the gold after his father's death to fulfill his wishes or some obligation to his father. He blatantly states that he didn't care about the gold, but never gives any ulterior motive to why he continued harvesting the roots, even after finding out what they really were. My personal theory is that he had some type of scientific curiosity about them at first, and then was driven mad by the realization of what him, his family, and his father and fellow conspirators had done to the world in the future. The real nut to crack is whether or not Edward even cares about what he's done. He does have some sense of duty, a belief that unlike Marvin, he has done something wrong and should be punished. Marvin only cares about consequences, but Crow ends up punishing himself. Though this could also be seen as a supremely selfish act, as the rest of his actions have been. He's dying already and chooses his own consequences. Not only that, but he asks Mara to finish the job, and while she's kind enough to do so, this is yet another selfish act he asks of her after already causing so much pain in her life. Edward does one selfless thing. He creates the cure for 5 people, but he's also the reason they were infected at all. Or at least his family is. It's so complicated. I'm just going to spill my thoughts a little here and gather this all together as best I can. Edward harvested the roots for 10 years. When the first guest came through, the roots were already halfway destroyed. The damage was done. Edward says he doesn't care about the gold, but how much can we really trust his word? The gold made his family incredibly wealthy. Maybe down the line he stopped caring about it, but if he really continued harvesting the roots because his father wanted him to, that seems incredibly vacuous. He already had enough money to live the rest of the time he wanted, so of course he wouldn't care about it. He's already incredibly wealthy. Then again, this fits the allegory for climate change. Excavating the roots made their family incredibly wealthy, and by the time they'd realized the damage was done, it was already too late. Why stop now? You've already fucked over the entire human race. Notice a continuing theme here. Edward feels he knows what's best for everybody. He decides that the guests are too far gone and kills them. He decides to continue the excavation of the roots. He doesn't pay for Mara's medical expenses, believing that someone should come to him to figure this all out. He experiments on the guests to make the cure, knowing that they were once human, and you could say that that is in itself an unselfish act, but it's still a very morally dubious one. With this line of thinking, you realize that Edward believed himself to be judge, jury, and executioner for almost everyone in the entire world. Having said that, Edward and Marvin are both incredibly selfish people, but in different ways. Marvin cared about money. He cared about his addiction and getting what he wanted. He cared about the fact that he was going to face consequences for what he did, not that he did something bad. About how unfair everything was for him personally when it all went south. It's also possible he was going to kill Edward as well, but of course we never get to find that out thanks to Julie. Edward seemed to only care about his own curiosity and a sense of duty, in spite of everyone else. He conducted monstrous experiments on the guests, allowed the roots to continue being harvested, and watched as the mutations became worse and worse, seemingly because he felt he knew what was best. He didn't contact the government or anyone else. He made all of the decisions. He is an incredibly selfish person. He does seem to care about his daughter, though not enough to tell her about the situation or stop, and also tried to make up for a few things. But even the way he does that is self-serving. He cared more about his personal guilt than humanity at large. It makes sense why Mara is so disgusted with him at the end of the game. On another interesting note with Edward, when he goes into the pool, he comes out and immediately attacks Mara, despite having no reason to. The guests also attack Mara, even though Tolman says that they don't mean harm. I have a theory for why this is, and it's also incredibly grave. That theory is that the mutations to the guests are giving them a form of violent dementia. At times, they might remember that they're human, realizing the horrific state their bodies are in. I can't imagine they'd be sane for very long with that happening. And at other times, they probably flick to being incoherent and violent animal-like monsters. The thought is honestly horrifying. The idea of disappearing from consciousness and snapping back to reality only to be in this constant state of horrific, Cronenbergian suffering and pain is harrowing to say the least. Not to mention the fact that us and Mara are killing what are just incredibly sick human beings, or monsters that retain some part of their humanity. This theory would explain why they attack our main characters, as well as how they have enough sense to paint 2106 all over the walls and not much else. But there's also the fact that this is a survival horror game and there need to be monsters to face. Realizations and thoughts like this are why this game made me cry. This game is really emotional if you get to thinking about it. Even though your time with these characters is brief, the game and its writing does a fantastic job at growing an understanding of them as you play. The way the characters are dressed, the props they have with them, the way they move, the way the music plays while you interact with them. They feel like real people with individual personalities, and the game wants you to know that. That's why I felt so sad when I found Harrison James dead. No! Knowing this character, seeing the look of shock and sadness on his deceased face. I don't like cops generally, and Harrison is a cop, but the story made me like Harrison. He was a good guy. He tried to save Mara's life by sending her home, and Mara tried to save his. The music that plays each time you meet him helped you understand that he was a goofy but inquisitive person. He was a little scared of what was happening, but came to help Natalie and figure out what was going on. It's sad that he ends up being killed by arguably one of the worst, most evil characters in the game, Marvin. I don't even think Harrison would have cared about Marvin being there, what he'd done. He just wanted everyone to be safe, and because of that, he gets shot and killed. He was goofy, and I mean he literally came to the park on a bike after Mara slashed his tires, but he felt like he had a sense of duty to do so. Even Mara is moved when she finds him, going so far as to give him a small eulogy while standing over his corpse. She obviously respected him, and seeing that she cares so much makes me as a player care even more. Harrison cared so much that he was killed for caring. Mara is even almost killed by the same person, but thankfully had main protagonist luck on her side. As I mentioned earlier, that whole last segment leading up to the fight with Edward was incredibly moving to me, especially as Mara/Elaine has to acknowledge it all after Marvin's death. How she takes charge, obviously upset by what's happened, but knowing she still has to do what she has to do. This stuff is powerful, and we get to sit with it as we climb down that long-ass ladder, and that beautiful song begins to play, and it just hits me emotionally. Before we move on, I do want to talk about the other characters. Again, Arthur doesn't have much going on in the story. He's one of the most innocent out of all the characters, along with Harrison. Julie, on the other hand, has a purpose for being here. She comes to serve papers and work on her case against Crow, showing her dedication to her law work. You'd think she'd put her life before a lawsuit, but the game implies that she is just lucky enough to never run into the monsters until the end of the game. The idea that she just ignores the monsters because she has a job to do is also funny, though. As I mentioned earlier, they do a good job at hinting that Mara and Julie know each other without saying it outright, but it's also interesting how removed from the core of the situation Julie seems. At first, it looks like she doesn't care, only there to do her job, but Mara helps her out and that seems to soften her up a little bit. And in turn, she helps Mara out, even if accidentally one time, but I don't think you really differentiate between accidentally saving your life and purposefully doing it. That's just saving someone's life, right? Even doing exactly as Mara asks before the final fight. I think, like Tolman, Julie is a very duty-oriented person. When she begins to realize the stakes of the situation, she shows a lot of respect and trust in Mara, aka Elaine, going along with her in spite of how silly it may seem at a distance. Despite the age difference between these two characters, it's nice to see how they work together. Julie doesn't just treat Mara as a client or just a kid, but as another person in a bad situation. I think this shows how good of a person Julie is at her core. I also want to touch back on Tolman's character as well. I mentioned this earlier, but I think Tolman is very similar to Julie, just on the opposite side of things. He worked for Crow and realized at some point what was happening with the pool and the roots. Tolman seems to have felt a duty to Edward and his station, even if he had an idea of the gravity of what was going on. While he does eventually turn off the machines excavating the roots, he still let it go on for quite some time. It's hard to tell why he's at the park when the game begins. I don't think he's trying to escape like Marvin, but more watch something he was a part of and keep tabs on it. He isn't running or hiding. Tolman is a tough nut to crack. I don't think he's a bad person, but he's definitely not innocent either. If anything, it seems that he comes to the park to make sure it's contained and keep an eye on Edward, who he might be able to tell has gone off the deep end. Then there's Natalie. I've said a few things on Natalie throughout the video, but she is one of the primary instigators of this story, calling in the missing persons report on her father that Elaine/Mara gets a hold of. She obviously cares about her father despite knowing some degree of his wrongdoings, enough so to come to the park and navigate it, even having seen and been attacked by the monsters, as well as convincing Mara/Elaine to go easy on him and give him another chance. We don't learn much about her besides this, but using that, we can see that one of the few redeeming qualities Edward had was that he must have been a good father at some point, and that Natalie seems to be an intelligent but emotional person who does love her father, despite him being somewhat of a bad guy. We never get to see what's in that note to Natalie that Edward wrote, so to some degree we can only ponder, really, who Natalie really is outside of all of this. We know that she loved her father and that she mourns him. Having explored all of these characters and talked about them, I love every character in this game if you can't tell. I think each of them is special in some little way, even Arthur. You see, Arthur's presence in the park is actually one of the first bits of environmental storytelling we encounter, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video. There are different parts of these items that allude to who we're going to find. The magazine itself is an oddities magazine, the backpack we find has a UFO tour patch on it, and the camera also has a picture of one of the guests, which ties directly back to mentioning the photo in the magazine. These items make the world feel lived in and make it feel as if Arthur is a real person with real interests. Continuing on this thread talking about environmental storytelling, let's discuss a bit more of the environmental storytelling that can be found in this game. At the start of the game, we see these little green tubes on top of Edward's car for some reason. We see these all over the park. Of course, later down the line, we figure out that these are harvested parts of the roots. I think this is not only just a little hint, showing you things that are actually meant to be important without you knowing it, but it's also meant to show just how useless the gold and the roots are to Edward and everyone else in the park at this point in the story. There's also the pool of blood in the parking lot, just basic foreshadowing, the camera which follows us throughout the parking lot, letting you know that someone is watching you. We don't know it's Edward Crow watching us at this point, but we know someone in the park is watching us. We also know Edward's car is here if we check the back tag. There's also the garbage all stacked up, just showing that the park has fallen into ruin, that no one is taking this garbage away. The whole game is filled with thoughtful little details like this. Some other examples are in the lounge. We have a book referencing gold mining, which, by the way, Harrison is later reading. We see a few pieces of the roots over there sitting on some cabinets, and yeah. When you first enter the lounge at the very beginning of the game, you can see Edward Crow's messed up face peeping through the secret painting peephole that we find later. So many people, myself included, missed this first time around when playing it. In fact, I don't know how many people have even seen it.
Good, yeah. Well, the voice actor for Sweet Tooth was, what's his name?
It's crazy to think that we see Edward this early in the game, but it's well hidden and happens so quickly that a lot of people didn't even notice it. And it's also crazy to think that the developers thought of this. Either it was there at the start or they went back and included it after getting through a lot of the game just to hint people in on this. That means that the person who closes the secret wall that I mentioned earlier is also probably Edward. It's just really neat to think about that little detail that so many people could miss, but it's still there and they don't care. They didn't go, look, this is happening. When you notice it, and you're blown away by it. Of course, there are other small attention to details made in the game, like Marvin's movement. He's one of the only characters in the game with such pronounced idle movements. Everyone has idle movements, but his are very over-exaggerated. Marvin has an idle movement like this because he's an addict, more than likely an alcoholic, but maybe more than that. Not to mention how he blocks his eyes from your flashlight and mentions he has a headache, which, is something people with hangovers have. Not to mention details like how each of the offices of one of the important people who worked at Crow Country, like Tolman, Douglas, or Edward, says a lot about them. From Douglas Pike, who obviously really loved his daughter, was kind of a mess but loved the park, to the hints that Edward was sick and studying the guests, and the fact that he loved his father so much that he would make a room dedicated to the camping trips that he and him went on, to the fact that there's an antenna cut from a radio in the room showing that Tolman was slowly piecing together what the guests were, even early on. Not to mention how organizational he is and how much of an important part of the secret operation he is, that they give him the power to activate the 4 elevators that go to it in his office. They also really neatly designed secrets that help you unlock other secrets, which creates a positive feedback loop of finding rewards that later help you solve puzzles to find more rewards. Of course, this is a core tenet of a lot of game design, but the fact that they put so much thought and effort into optional content as well is great. Going back to a point that I made much earlier, the game can also technically be done out of order, which is really fun. In my first playthrough, at the point you're supposed to help Julie, you can instead go through the haunted house first and explore the offices hidden within. And if you do help Julie first, you can take the crank and skip the haunted house, instead going into the Ocean Kingdom area before ever exploring the haunted house. Of course, you do have to get all of the items eventually and solve specific puzzles to push the game forward, but there are a lot of points when the game opens up and allows you to go where you want if you haven't done everything yet. This also feeds into how interconnected the entire map of Crow Country really is. There are so many little doors and shortcuts and secret passages that open up as you further explore the park, which just makes traversing it even easier and feel even cooler. The backtracking in Crow Country never really feels like a chore because there always seems to be another shortcut that can take you back to a place you needed to go quicker from where you are. Some Resident Evil games have you walk all the way to the back of a core area and then you have to walk all the way back through it, but in Crow Country it uses most of its spaces maximally. It makes it feel even spookier, almost like the entire theme park itself is a haunted house full of secret passages in disguise. At first it seems so small, but then it just keeps opening and opening up and you keep wondering when the next secret passage is going to jump out at you. As I said in the first half of the video, there are a lot of little puzzles in the game, and while they are quite easy, I still find them fun because of how they fit into the lore and world established without much question. Like the sea monster puzzle, which the game explains was part of how the restaurant celebrated kids' birthdays, or the witch's maze, which was just straight up one of the attractions in the park. This extends to many of the secrets that you can find in the park as well, which mostly consist of hidden weapons and ammo, which can easily be explained by the paranoia of Edward, except the mushroom boys, they're just magic, I guess. Adding on to that, the overall theming of this game is impeccable. Each room and area feels like it could have been a real-life area in a local theme or entertainment park. It's all delightfully disturbing as well. That spike door I mentioned earlier that leads into the Ocean Kingdom is so unnecessarily gruesome. The fact that the Iron Maiden in the Haunted Hills area of the park is a secret door is also really neat. The Dracula sitting up in the coffin in the Haunted Mansion is really cool and a small detail that makes it feel fun and real and lived in. Speaking of Dracula, oh my god. The sound design in this game is really stellar. I've talked about this in the past, but sound design, it's one of those things that if it works, you actually just kind of accept it because it eases you into the world even more when everything just lines up. Your brain just takes it as, oh, this is what it should sound like, and I think they did a fantastic job of that throughout this game. All the sounds, the little creaks, the footsteps, the weapon sounds, the monsters, the ambience, the guests sound so forlorn, at times pitiful or sorrowful as well as scary. The UI sounds are also fantastic. They feel nostalgic but also unique. Just going through the menu or picking up a key item, I think it all feels great and feels like it should. It just clicks in your mind, like I said. I also love that sound coming through your headphones is exactly what sound Mara would hear through her specific ears. Let me explain. If I'm facing an enemy, it sounds kind of distant. But then if I turn Mara and her left ear is facing that enemy, I hear the sound for that monster through my left headphone. When I first started playing it, I hadn't realized this and it felt a little disorienting, but when it clicks, I really liked it a lot. It helps you rationalize the area around you based off of the orientation of the character that you're playing as. You can tell where sounds are coming from just based off of what direction Mara is facing and what ear cup the sound was coming through. I mean, unless you're playing on speakers, I played with headphones. Continuing on sound, the music really hits it out of the park on this one. The OST creator, Ockeroid, did a fantastic job, and I'm going to give this game the highest praise I can give it, which is that it feels like it would fit right in with the classic survival horror OSTs from survival horror's heyday. Early Resident Evil games, the Silent Hill series, it fits right in there with them. If you played this and said, hey, what game do you think this comes from? I guarantee you there would be people who would be like, Resident Evil? And you'd be like, no, haha, actually, popular indie horror game Crow Country that came out in 2024. And I think it nails something that a lot of modern horror game OSTs, including some of the new Resident Evils that I really like Resident Evil 7, lack. To put it simply, a lot of modern horror game tracks aren't super memorable as pieces of music. They're somewhat generic cinema score style horror ambiance, big strings and droning noise. Usually the most unique pieces are the main menu theme and the save room theme in the new Resident Evil games, plus a handful of others, and then the rest are this cinematic style of horror score that all kind of blend together. It makes some modern horror games like Resident Evil 7 sound more like The Conjuring, which maybe that's what they're going for, and it is scary. I still think those soundtracks are good, but there's a reason I only listen to a handful of the music from games like Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, and Resident Evil 7 is one of my favorite Resident Evil games of all time. I will note that this is a personal taste thing. I'll also add that not many people listen to the tracks that are meant to scare you in games very casually, because they're made to be grating on purpose. They're made to enhance fear. Whether it be a shrill string quartet in Resident Evil or the incredible thrashing heavy machine music of the Silent Hill series, it makes sense why you don't listen to the music that plays when you fight monsters, but instead the chill stuff. What I'm getting at is that in Crow Country, nearly the entire soundtrack is amazing both inside and outside of the game's context. Even the stuff that's meant to scare you, I like, though I probably won't be listening to it on my, relaxing walks as much as I'll listen to stuff like this. I can't gush about the music in this game enough. The music is really good. It's fun, it's melodic, it's interesting, but it also just fits a lot of the areas that it's made for while being all of those things. Some of it is darkly whimsical. Other tracks are vague and mysterious. Some are silly but fitting to the area, meant to show the contrast between the horrific events happening and the original intended purpose of a theme park, which is to spread joy and not to be a place of horrors. And those places were designed by people as the music was, and so I have to add that the art in this game is fantastic. Everything looks like a diorama or a toy set and sticks within that framework faithfully. From the design of the park itself to the characters and the monsters within it, the design of this game is on point. Marvin in his dirty suit and Tolman wearing his safety gear, Natalie in her 80s blazer and skirt combo looking like a businesswoman on the go. Mara's own outfit is striking, plain white with those bright red gloves and purple hair give her a bit of a rebellious look. The monsters also look monstrous, even if some of them are also kind of cute. I'm not kidding when I say that in my first two playthroughs, this monster scared me. I was terrified of puppets as a kid, And this thing looks like a monstrous little puppet and even runs at you. It makes this like weird little sound. Oh, it's awful, and I hated it. My favorite area design-wise would definitely be the Haunted Hills. Yes, I am a horror channel, but I just think the theming here is nailed perfectly. Each little room is so well crafted. The opening area is fun and feels like something you'd see in a 90s Goosebumps episode about Halloween. Though the scariest room in the game definitely goes to the Mushroom King's room that I mentioned earlier, as it feels the most horrifically otherworldly. I'm adding this in after the fact while editing, but the lighting in this game is also spectacular. It's another one of those things that, like, it just kind of goes over your head while playing it, even though you soak it in. There's so many areas in this game that are so well lit, and it perfectly fits the theme of the room or whatever is happening. And, you know, there's also the fact that the game goes through this day and night cycle, which is one of those things that kind of goes under the rug, but I really appreciated it when I was playing it, and I just wanted to throw that in there, that it's just really cool that it does those things, that it deals with this lighting, that different areas can have lighting changes based on things that have happened throughout the game. It's fantastic, and again, it makes the world feel real and lived in. I do want to just say that a lot of what I've talked about and gushed about in this video was a part of the goals that the creator set for themselves when making Crow Country, and I'd say for the most part, they've accomplished everything that they set out to do. This game is truly amazing. It is a fantastic piece of survival horror, game, art, everything that amidst a, frankly, fantastic year for survival horror, especially in the indie space, but also in the AAA space. We're getting the Dead Rising remake as well as the Silent Hill 2 remake. It's really been a great couple of years for survival horror, even considering last year, and it's just amazing, really. Having said all of that, having gushed as much as I did, I do have some criticisms, even if they are pretty limited. One thing is that in the gameplay department, it is very by the numbers. I don't think the developers were trying to elevate the gameplay styling of the survival horror genre or anything, so that's completely fine. I feel like the combat could have been fleshed out a little bit more, maybe even give us a lock-on option. The aiming in the 3D space is pretty okay for the most part, but at times can be frustrating. Like I mentioned at the start, they do include tank controls in the game, which is nice, but the game definitely feels like it was designed with modern controls in mind, especially considering you can control the camera yourself, and there aren't any settings to fully take that control away that make the game feel fluid. The shotgun is also not very good. It feels like a really powerful close-up melee weapon more than a gun. In my time playing, I never noticed it hitting multiple enemies, even if they were grouped together in front of me. This was something I didn't pick up on until like my second or third playthrough though, so again, not a huge deal at all, but something I picked up on as I played and was just trying to feel how the game played. And of course, the game is a bit too easy. They even added a hard mode to the game after it came out, for people who wanted a bit more of a challenge, which I do appreciate, and I have beaten it on the hard mode and can say that it is a bit more of a challenge. It's not like jaw-clenchingly hard, but it's more. You know, you have to be a bit more mindful of your resources and your health. And that's all, folks. That's everything I have to say about Crow Country. This video has taken way too long to make. Like, this was meant to be finished like months ago, but it's finally done now. If you're listening to this now, you've gotten through my video, I've gotten through my video. Crow Country is a really special game, probably one of the best survival horror games this year, and that's saying a lot considering what we're getting. The love and care that was put into this game by everyone involved is immense, and it rubs off on you as you experience it. But it's not derivative either, at least not in the ways that really matter. Yes, it sticks to some of the genre staples, but it does its own thing with them, and I love it for that. This game perfectly rides the line between simple and deep. It rides the line between paying homage to that came before it, while also taking steps towards doing something new itself. Simple gameplay with a fantastic and deep story, a lovely and nostalgic art style, and some banger-ass music and sound, and one of the better endings to a survival horror game that I've ever played in general. I've covered the story, I've covered the technical aspects, and told you what I love and even a bit of criticism, and I can't recommend Crow Country enough. I hope it becomes one of those I come back to every few years, but only time will tell. And I hope SFB Games, that made the game, makes a sequel or more like this. Honestly, something I've wanted out of indie survival horror creators is to do like Capcom did in the late 90s and early 2000s. They created a formula and they stuck with it for a bit because it worked. And if Crow Country is a formula they think they can work with, which I'd say it is since survival horror games like it have existed since the 90s and early 2000s and are making a comeback in a big way, I would love to see more games like this from them. But of course, it's their choice, and I'm just saying this because I really liked Crow Country. I would love to see anything from them. In fact, playing Crow Country has made me want to play their other games. And now I want to say some thank yous. Thank you to Adam Vian on Twitter for letting me ask him many questions. He's one of the two brothers at the top of SFB Games, and they really did make a fantastic game in Crow Country. Go check out both of them and follow them on Twitter. I'm going to link both of their Twitter accounts down below. And also thank you to @PhilipReedArt on Twitter for allowing me to use his Crow Country fan art as one of my thumbnail variants. He did this fan art months ago, and I just really liked it and asked his permission to use it as my thumbnail, and he graciously allowed me to do so. So a big thank you to him for allowing me to use his amazing art as my thumbnail. It's very nice of him to let me do that. Of course, I am testing a bunch of thumbnails to see which does best in the algorithm, but his art is fantastic. It's on screen now. Please check him out. He takes commissions, and I've linked his socials below. Also, thank you to Ockeroid for making an absolute banger soundtrack, which you've heard throughout this video. The music is from the game. I bought the soundtrack myself, and I'm also going to link that below down to his SoundCloud and his Twitter, and you should check him out too. And last but not least, my lovely patrons and YouTube members. We have Southbridge, Cade Kirk, and AshBob5000 over on YouTube. Remember that donating to my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member helps me out. It gives me money which I can use to keep myself afloat and keep making videos. But having said that, I'm going to get to play even more survival horror this year, because I still haven't played Signalis, I haven't finished Conscript, I haven't finished Hollow Body, the Dead Rising remake is coming out in less than a week, the Silent Hill 2 remake comes out on the 9th of October, and then Post Trauma comes out at the end of October. I'm going crazy with how much stuff that I get to play and enjoy. It's awesome. I'm so pumped and grateful for the timeline we live in, except for all of the bad stuff, but that's not what this video is about. Anyway, I'm GhostsOnHoliday. Thank you for letting me haunt your digital devices for just a little bit. And remember,
back with another milk. Hey!